Have you ever wondered how far human cruelty can go when it hides behind the mask of power and immortality? Imagine a ruler so obsessed with control, so desperate to defy the grip of death, that he turned his kingdom into a stage for unspeakable horrors. This is not the tale of some monster born in the shadows. It is about a boy king of Egypt who rose to the throne at just 6 years old, a child who would grow into one of history's most twisted figures. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. His name was Pepi II, and the legends surrounding him paint a picture of a pharaoh whose hunger for dominance transformed into a nightmare for everyone around him. His reign was not defined by the marvels of pyramids or the glory of conquest, but by whispers of grotesque rituals, whispers that still cling to his memory like the stench of something rotten that refuses to fade. Pepi's story begins in innocence, or at least what seemed like innocence. A child pharaoh, adored by his people, his very presence was a promise of stability in a time when dynasties rose and fell with terrifying speed. But childhood quickly warped into something far darker. The young king became fascinated with the idea that he was chosen not just to rule, but to surpass mortality itself. And so he sought ways to twist the natural order, reaching for immortality not through legacy or divine favor, but through acts that would scar his kingdom forever. Stories say that as Pepi grew, so did his appetite for cruelty. What started as curiosity turned into obsession, and that obsession demanded victims. It began with honey, a substance sweet, golden, and divine to the Egyptians, a symbol of purity and offering to the gods. But under Pepi, honey transformed into something unholy. He ordered slaves to be coated from head to toe in it. Their bodies turned into living sacrifices meant to draw flies, insects, and swarms of pests. They stood helpless under the burning sun, unable to wipe the crawling creatures from their skin. To the pharaoh, it was a spectacle, a cruel form of entertainment masked as ritual. He believed that by surrounding himself with life drawn to the sweetness of honey, he could somehow absorb its eternal essence, warding off decay and death. But what it truly revealed was the beginning of his descent into a world where human suffering became the currency of his ambitions. These rituals grew in scale and savagery. He no longer saw his subjects as people, but as tools in his pursuit of eternal life. Prisoners and servants were dragged into chambers where experiments unfolded in secret, their screams muffled by stone walls that hid the pharaoh's madness from the world outside. He imagined that through torment he could extract the secrets of the soul, that pain itself was a doorway into the divine. Each act pushed him further into the shadows, reshaping his court into a place where fear reigned more powerfully than loyalty. And as years passed, the boy king turned into a ruler whose name struck terror into the hearts of those who dared whisper about the atrocities within his palace. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, carried across villages and into the desert winds, telling tales of children taken from their families under the cover of night. No one knew where they went, though many suspected the truth. Pepi believed that youth itself, the spark of innocence and vitality, could be stolen and consumed. He saw children as vessels of life, their purity a key to his immortality. And so, one by one, they vanished never to be seen again. Families lived in constant dread, clinging tightly to their young, praying the pharaoh's gaze would fall elsewhere. Egypt, once a land of glory, found itself haunted by silence and fear, its people trapped in the grip of a ruler who saw them as offerings rather than citizens. The palace that once shimmered as a beacon of royal grandeur became a fortress of dread. Servants who once bustled with devotion now moved like shadows, fearful of drawing too much attention, terrified that even a glance in the wrong direction could mark them as the next sacrifice. The laughter of children no longer echoed through the courtyards. Instead, the silence pressed heavy, broken only by rumors that slithered through the corridors like snakes in the sand. To the outside world, Egypt appeared strong under Pepi's reign, but those who lived closest to him knew that its foundation was rotting beneath the weight of his unholy obsessions. Every ritual Pepi performed seemed to deepen his conviction that he was brushing against the edges of eternity. He claimed to feel the gods whispering to him, voices urging him to go further, to take more, to offer more suffering in exchange for their secrets. His advisors, powerless and petrified, dared not challenge him. Some convinced themselves he was truly chosen by divine forces, while others silently despised him but kept their heads bowed, knowing that open defiance meant certain doom. In those days, the line between faith and madness blurred so completely that no one could tell if Pepi was delusional or if some darker force had truly wrapped itself around his soul. The honey rituals continued, but they were no longer enough to satisfy him. He demanded greater spectacles, more elaborate displays of control over life and death. He had entire chambers designed for these grotesque ceremonies, filled with carvings that twisted sacred symbols into something monstrous. The walls were said to drip with the residue of his rituals, a sickly sweetness in the air that mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Those unfortunate enough to be brought into these rooms seldom came out again, and the few who did were broken in ways words could never describe. Their eyes carried the emptiness of souls that had brushed too close to a darkness beyond comprehension. But Pepi's reign of terror was not just confined to the hidden halls of his palace. He began extending his twisted experiments into the very streets of Egypt. Festivals that were once joyous celebrations of harvest and faith turned into stages for his rituals. Where once there had been music and dance, there were now cries of pain and rivers of fear. He would step out before the crowd, adorned in golden regalia that gleamed under the sun, and proclaim his power over mortality. To the people, he was both God and monster, a ruler they had no choice but to worship even as they trembled under his gaze. Parents clutched their children tighter, hoping the gods themselves would shield them from the king's hunger. Behind this madness lay a single, unshakable truth. Pepi could not accept the inevitability of death. The more his body aged, the more desperate his rituals became. Each wrinkle on his skin, each ache in his bones, ignited a frenzy within him. He believed time was his greatest enemy, and the only way to defeat it was to feast on the life of others. The irony was as cruel as it was chilling. In his desperate terror of death, Pepi II committed acts so grotesque that his name would never be remembered with reverence, but cursed with infamy. Egypt had seen many rulers obsessed with immortality, pharaohs who raised pyramids and carved monuments to defy time itself, but none pursued it with such twisted obsession as Pepi. Whispers spread through the kingdom. Some said the pharaoh no longer looked like a man at all. His eyes glimmered unnaturally in the torchlight. His skin pulled too tightly over his frame, as if he had forced himself into a form the gods never intended. It was said he no longer slept, but wandered the palace in endless restless hours, haunted by voices only he could hear. Those voices, the people whispered, urged him onward, gave him permission to sink deeper into the abyss of his madness. Egypt, once the land of gods and glory, had become nothing more than the stage for one man's war against the inevitable. Even the Nile, eternal lifeblood of the kingdom, seemed diminished beneath his shadow. Its waters still flowed, feeding the fields, Yet the laughter of farmers vanished, replaced by uneasy silence. Where there had once been songs, there were only fearful glances, mothers clutching their children, fathers dreading the approach of soldiers who might claim their sons or daughters to satisfy the pharaoh's demands. The soil, rich with the gifts of the river, now felt tainted, as though it drank not just water, but sorrow. And above it all, Pepi watched from the heights of his palace. To him, every offering, every ritual, every trembling life taken in his name was another step toward freeing himself from the chains of mortality. He cloaked himself in the company of magicians, priests, and seers, men who promised forbidden knowledge, rituals, and charms that might halt the decay of flesh. Some claimed they could summon the voices of gods, others that they could distill eternity into a single elixir. Pepi indulged them all, no matter the price. Gold flowed from his treasury into their hands, not as a gift, but as a command. Deliver results, or join the countless souls already lost to his twisted pursuits. Sorcerers, healers, and priests tried desperately, chanting sacred words, burning fragrant incense, and mixing potions under the unblinking gaze of their king. Yet none could grant him the eternal youth he demanded. When their promises crumbled, their cries of agony joined the endless echoes that haunted the palace walls. In time, Pepi's madness grew into conviction. He no longer saw himself as a mortal pharaoh, but as a living god. Human limits, he declared, did not apply to him, and those who dared suggest otherwise were silenced forever. He cloaked himself in sacred emblems, twisting their meanings until he believed the divine forces of Ra, Osiris, and Anubis pulsed within his very blood. But even as he claimed immortality, his body betrayed him. Skin sagging, hair thinning, steps faltering. Each reminder of age stoked his rage, fueling ever darker sacrifices, ever bloodier rituals, ever more innocent lives consumed in his obsession with conquering death. Soon, disappearances shadowed every corner of Egypt. Fear seeped into the homes of nobles and commoners alike. Parents hid their children, smuggling them into distant villages or entrusting them to far-off relatives, praying to escape the pharaoh's notice. Mothers wept in silence. Fathers stood trembling at their doors with weapons in hand, knowing resistance was futile against a king's decree. And still the palace guards came, unopposed, unquestioned. When they left, they carried silence with them, for those taken were never seen again. To even whisper their names was to invite suspicion, and suspicion in Pepi's Egypt meant certain death. But even fear has its limits, and whispers soon began to twist into quiet rebellion. Among priests and commoners alike, doubts grew stronger. Was Pepi truly chosen by the gods, or had he betrayed them? Some believed Egypt itself was beginning to curse him, that the droughts and poor harvests creeping into the land were punishments for the pharaoh's sins. Others prayed desperately, asking the gods to intervene, to strike down the man who had turned their sacred traditions into mockery. Yet Pepi, blinded by his obsession, saw every hardship not as a warning, but as a challenge to push further. He believed that suffering was proof of his progress, that the gods demanded more blood before rewarding him with eternal life. And so he gave them more. Entire groups of prisoners were sacrificed in grotesque ceremonies that lasted through the night, their cries rising like smoke into the star-filled sky. He bathed himself in their agony, convinced it was cleansing him of decay. His chambers grew darker, the very air heavy with the weight of what had been done inside them. Those who entered spoke of feeling watched, as if unseen eyes glared from the walls themselves, eyes belonging not to gods, but to the countless souls trapped by Pepi's madness. And yet, to him, this was triumph. To him, it was proof that he was on the threshold of greatness. As the years dragged on, Pepi's obsession tightened its grip, wrapping around his mind like a serpent that would never release. The palace, once a symbol of divine order, had become a theater of horror where his will was law and his law was madness. Servants whispered that the walls themselves had begun to absorb the cries of the dying, so that even in silence, faint echoes of suffering could be heard if one dared to listen closely. The pharaoh no longer cared to hide his practices in secrecy. What had once been rituals performed behind locked doors were now displayed with chilling pride, as though he wanted the entire kingdom to witness his defiance of mortality. He began to speak openly of his victories against death, pointing to his survival as proof that the gods favored him above all others. But those closest to him saw the truth, the aging lines carved deep into his face, the weakness in his voice when he thought no one was listening, the trembling in his hands that no jewelry or gold could disguise. His body was failing, yet he forced himself to believe otherwise, declaring that every sacrifice added years to his life. And though his decrees still commanded obedience, fewer and fewer believed his words. The people began to see him not as divine, but as a man desperate and broken, willing to destroy everything around him just to escape the fate he could not accept. In his most extreme moments, he sought to create rituals so elaborate and so grotesque that even his most loyal priests hesitated to participate. He ordered vast pits dug into the earth, their walls lined with oil and pitch. Into these pits, victims were lowered, their bodies painted with honey until they glistened like golden idols under the torchlight. Then, as insects swarmed, Pepi would watch from above, his face twisted in something between awe and hunger, convinced that by observing the life devouring theirs, he could seize the essence slipping away. The air would grow thick with buzzing, cries, and the sweet, sickening smell of decay, while the pharaoh stood motionless, drinking it all in as if it were divine revelation. The kingdom itself seemed to recoil. Plagues of locusts swept across fields, destroying crops before they could be harvested. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, faltered in its floods, leaving cracked earth where fertile soil once thrived. To the people, these were unmistakable signs that the gods had turned their faces away, that Pepi's madness had cursed them all. Yet he denied it. He insisted the gods were testing him, demanding more loyalty, more sacrifice, more suffering. And so, in his desperation, he pushed further, dragging Egypt with him into an abyss that no one could escape. Rumors spread that Pepi had begun experimenting with ways to extract the very life force from his victims. Some said he drank their blood, believing it carried youth. Others whispered of chambers where he tried to capture their final breath in sacred jars, convinced that by inhaling it, he could absorb their vitality. The palace grew darker, the ritual stranger, until those who served within its walls could no longer tell where myth ended and reality began. What they knew for certain was that death was everywhere, clinging to the air like smoke, staining their dreams with visions they wished they could forget. And through it all, Pepi II convinced himself that he was winning. Every morning he woke to see the sun rise and declared it proof that he was defying the inevitable. Every night he commanded new ceremonies, determined to stretch his life a little longer. He was a man who had traded his humanity for obsession, his legacy for terror, his kingdom for the fleeting hope of eternity. Egypt had seen kings who sought immortality through monuments of stone and grand tombs that defied time. But Pepi sought it through living flesh, leaving behind not monuments of glory, but memories so dark they would never fade. The people of Egypt lived under a sky that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year of Pepi's rule. Families no longer gathered in the evenings to tell stories or sing songs. Instead, they whispered prayers into the night, begging for protection from the gaze of their pharaoh. Markets that once buzzed with life grew quiet, as mothers clutched their children close and fathers cast suspicious glances at every soldier who passed. Even festivals, once the heartbeat of Egyptian life, had turned into spectacles of dread, where citizens were forced to stand as unwilling witnesses to their ruler's madness. The joyous spirit of the nation had withered, replaced by a silence thick with fear. Inside the palace, Pepi's hunger for eternal life had twisted him beyond recognition. He rarely appeared in public without layers of gold and sacred symbols draped across his frail frame, as if he were trying to disguise the truth of his aging body. But behind the grandeur, his skin sagged, his teeth rotted, and his eyes carried the glassy sheen of someone haunted by his own reflection. To conceal these signs, he surrounded himself with priests and magicians who promised illusions of youth. They painted his face with powders, bound his limbs with linens soaked in strange oils, and bathed him in concoctions that smelled of death more than life. Yet no matter how hard they tried, nothing could stop the relentless march of time. The more his body betrayed him, the more violent his rituals became. He demanded sacrifices at a scale Egypt had never seen before. Dozens at a time were taken from their homes, dragged into chambers where torches flickered against walls etched with twisted carvings of gods. The victims' cries blended into a chorus that echoed through the palace like a song of despair. But to Pepi, it was music proof that he was still fighting, still clawing at the edges of immortality. He stood in the center of it all, his voice booming with chants he barely understood, his trembling hands reaching for the life slipping away from those around him. But with each passing season, the land itself seemed to rise in rebellion. Crops failed more often, leaving families to starve. Storms battered villages, and the Nile's blessings became unpredictable, its floods too weak or too strong, devastating the fields it once nourished. People whispered that the gods were punishing not just Pepi, but all of Egypt for the horrors he had unleashed. Temples that once celebrated the pharaoh's divine right now grew quieter, their priests torn between loyalty to their king and loyalty to the gods they had served for generations. And slowly, ever so slowly, faith in Pepi began to fracture. Those closest to him, his generals, his advisors, even some of his priests could see the truth. The pharaoh's mind had become a labyrinth of obsession and paranoia. He trusted no one, certain that enemies lurked in every shadow. He accused his own men of betrayal, ordering their executions on the thinnest suspicion. Some nights he wandered the palace halls, muttering to voices no one else could hear, convinced that spirits were guiding him. The boy who once sat on the throne with the promise of a bright future had transformed into a hollow shell of a man who clung desperately to the idea that he could outwit death itself. And yet, despite the despair, whispers of resistance began to stir among the people. Quiet conversations behind closed doors, hidden prayers for deliverance, and secret gatherings of those who still believed Egypt could be saved. The pharaoh had ruled for decades, but even a reign steeped in fear could not last forever. The land was weary, the people broken, and the gods, whether silent or vengeful, seemed to be watching. Pepi may have believed he was on the brink of immortality, but his kingdom was on the brink of collapse. As Pepi's reign dragged into its later years, the pharaoh who had once been crowned as a child of promise was now a ruler whose very presence seemed to cast a shadow over the land. His paranoia consumed him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity until nothing remained but suspicion and fear. He trusted no one, not his generals, not his priests, not even his closest attendants. Every whisper behind closed doors sounded to him like conspiracy. Every glance felt like betrayal. He began to withdraw deeper into the heart of his palace, surrounding himself with guards whose loyalty was bought with fear, not devotion, and priests too terrified to question the nightmare they served. But even in isolation, his rituals did not cease. If anything, they grew more grotesque, as though the fewer people he trusted, the more he relied on the screams of his victims to reassure him that he still held power over life and death. He ordered new chambers to be built, hidden deeper within the palace walls, chambers designed not for comfort but for suffering. Here, torches burned low, casting long shadows over walls inscribed with symbols so twisted they seemed to mock the very gods they once honored. The air was thick, not only with smoke but with the unmistakable weight of dread, as though the stones themselves had grown heavy with the cries they had absorbed. Witnesses claimed he had begun to see himself not just as a god, but as a being who had transcended the gods themselves. He boasted that he had unlocked secrets that even Osiris and Ra could not command, secrets purchased with blood and fear. To prove it, he subjected his victims to rituals that defied comprehension. Some were sealed alive in jars filled with honey, their bodies entombed in sticky sweetness until life slowly drained away. Others were forced to endure days of torment while Pepi watched in silence, studying the precise moment their souls seemed to depart, convinced that if he could catch that fleeting instant, he could snare eternity in his grasp. But the truth was clear to everyone but Pepi. He was not becoming immortal. He was withering. His body grew frail, his movements labored, his once commanding voice reduced to a rasp. His eyes, once sharp with the arrogance of youth, now burned with fevered desperation. He wore layers of gold and jewels to disguise his decay, but nothing could mask the stench of sickness that clung to him. Still, he raged against the truth, ordering more lives to be taken, more rituals to be performed, as though he could shout down the reality that death was closing in. Beyond the palace walls, the kingdom crumbled. Trade routes weakened, famine spread, and Egypt's once mighty prestige began to fade under the weight of despair. Other lands saw a kingdom ruled not by divine order, but by chaos, and whispers of rebellion stirred at the edges of the empire. Yet inside his fortress of fear, Pepi remained blind to the suffering of his people. To him, their pain was merely fuel, their lives a resource to be drained in his endless war against mortality. He could not see that his reign, once promised as a golden age, had become a legacy of ruin. Still, the rituals continued. Night after night, he called upon his priests to chant, his servants to prepare victims, his guards to enforce obedience. Night after night, the cries of the dying rose into the dark sky above Egypt, carrying with them the weight of a kingdom held hostage by one man's obsession. And night after night, Pepi convinced himself that he was winning, that his heart still beat because he had mastered secrets no mortal was meant to know. But in truth, he was not defying death, he was only postponing it. And with every passing hour, the sands of time slipped faster through his grasp. Time, the very enemy Pepi had spent his life trying to conquer, marched on without mercy. His kingdom felt it in every failing harvest, in every village abandoned to famine, in every family torn apart by his endless demands. The grandeur of Egypt dimmed under his rule, its temples less vibrant, its monuments left unfinished, its people worn down by the weight of despair. Even those who had once worshipped him as a living god now struggled to hide their doubt, their faith eroded by the endless cycle of cruelty that brought no salvation. Whispers turned into quiet curses, murmured when the torches burned low, when they believed the Pharaoh's spies could not hear. Within the palace, Pepi became a prisoner of his own madness. His chambers, once adorned with the finest treasures of the Nile, had grown cluttered with strange objects from his rituals, jars sealed with wax, filled with unholy mixtures, tools of bronze and stone stained from their use, offerings twisted into shapes that no god would ever recognize. He sat among them like a king of shadows, his frail body propped up with cushions, his mind gnawed by the constant terror that death was at his door. Sleep became a stranger to him. When his eyes closed, he dreamed of the countless faces of those he had sacrificed, their stares accusing, their voices whispering promises of vengeance. He would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, demanding more ceremonies to silence the phantoms that haunted him. The priests, once fearful servants of his will, now served him with a kind of weary resignation. They no longer believed in his quest, but they obeyed, for disobedience meant death. Their chants rang hollow, their prayers empty, yet Pepi clung to them as if each word could bind him tighter to life. He demanded that they find new ways, new methods, new offerings to stave off the decay that was consuming him. But the more they gave, the less it seemed to matter. His body betrayed him with each passing day. His steps slowed, his voice faltered. His once commanding presence reduced to little more than the fragile frame of an old man too proud to admit defeat. Still, he tried to convince himself and those around him that he had achieved what no mortal had. He pointed to his long reign as proof, boasting that he had ruled for decades when so many others had fallen. He proclaimed that the gods themselves envied his endurance, that every moment he continued to breathe was a triumph over the natural order. But behind closed doors, those who served him saw the truth. They saw the sores that would not heal, the trembling of his hands, the hollow gaze of eyes clouded with age. They knew that his time was slipping away, no matter how tightly he tried to grasp it. Outside the palace, the people waited. They waited for the day when the pharaoh's grip would falter, when the cruelty that had defined their lives might finally end. They did not dare to rebel openly, but their patience grew thin, their prayers more desperate. Some spoke of leaving Egypt altogether, seeking safety beyond its borders, away from the shadow of a ruler who had turned their land into a tomb. Others clung to the hope that the gods would intervene, that justice would come not from human hands but from divine wrath. Whatever the form, they longed for release, for the chains of Pepi's obsession to finally shatter. But Pepi, blind to all of it, continued his rituals. He could not stop. He would not stop. For him, to cease was to admit defeat, to acknowledge the truth he had spent his life denying. And so he pressed on, dragging Egypt with him into the abyss, even as the sands of time slipped faster and faster through his fingers. The final years of Pepi's reign were like the last flickers of a dying flame, erratic, unpredictable, and filled with smoke that choked everyone around him. Egypt, once the envy of nations, had become a land stretched thin, its people weary of the endless demands, its leaders drained of loyalty, and its spirit broken. The Nile, which had long been the giver of life, now seemed to mock its pharaoh. Some years it flooded too little, leaving barren fields cracked and dry. Other years it raged too fiercely, drowning what little hope the farmers had. To the people it was a sign. The gods were no longer blessing their land. The gods were angry. Within the palace, the pharaoh's decline was no longer something that could be hidden. His body had become frail beyond disguise, his voice weak, his hands trembling as he leaned heavily on attendants to move from one chamber to another. His skin bore the marks of age and disease, yet still he refused to accept the truth. He demanded that his priests perform daily ceremonies, layering his body with oils and wrappings as though he could mummify himself while still alive, sealing away the decay even as he breathed. His attendants saw him for what he was, not an immortal god, but an old man terrified of the very thing that awaited every mortal soul. But terror made him dangerous. His paranoia had reached its peak. and no one around him was safe. Advisors who hesitated even slightly were accused of treason and executed. Guards who faltered in their duties vanished without a trace. Even priests who had once been indispensable were dragged away at the faintest suggestion of disloyalty. The palace was no longer a seat of power, it was a cage of fear, where every servant wondered if each sunrise would be their last. Outside those walls, the whispers of rebellion grew louder. Farmers spoke of abandoning their fields rather than feeding a king who drained them dry. Soldiers muttered about deserting their posts, no longer willing to kill their own people in the name of a pharaoh who seemed more spirit than man. And among the noble families, once loyal to the crown, alliances began to fray as they secretly prepared for the inevitable. They could see the writing on the walls. Egypt could not endure under Pepi forever. But Pepi refused to let go. He had ruled longer than any pharaoh before him, and he clung to that fact like a trophy. To him, it was proof that he had succeeded, that he had bent time to his will. He boasted that while others had crumbled, he still sat upon the throne, and he demanded that history remember him as eternal. Yet behind his words was desperation, a man who could feel death at his doorstep, but who would rather drag an empire into ruin than admit defeat. The rituals continued, though they had long since lost any meaning. The chants rang hollow, the sacrifices meaningless, the gods silent. Even the priests who performed them no longer believed in what they were doing. They carried out the ceremonies only to survive, their voices flat, their eyes empty, as though they too had become trapped in the endless cycle of Pepi's madness. The palace, once a place of majesty, had become a tomb long before its ruler ever joined the dead. And still he raged against the inevitable. Night after night, he whispered to himself that he would endure, that he would defy the order of the universe, that he would never kneel before death. But death waits for all men, and even kings cannot bargain forever. Though Pepi could not see it, his time was already crumbling like the walls of his neglected monuments. Egypt was waiting for the moment when the shadow that had ruled them for decades would finally fade. The palace grew quieter in Pepi's final years, not with peace, but with the suffocating stillness of decay. The great halls, once filled with the bustling of servants and the chants of priests, echoed now with hollow footsteps and the murmurs of those who dared not raise their voices above a whisper. Torches flickered weakly against walls darkened by smoke, their flames seeming as tired as the man who clung to his throne. Even the air itself was heavy, thick with the scent of oils and incense burned endlessly in a futile attempt to mask the stench of illness and death that clung to the pharaoh's chambers. Pepi lay surrounded by treasures meant to affirm his godhood: statues of gold, vessels of alabaster, amulets inscribed with sacred texts. Yet none of it could shield him from the reality gnawing at his bones. His body had become a cage of weakness, his voice a whisper, his breaths shallow. Still, his eyes burned with the same feverish obsession, demanding sacrifices, demanding chants, demanding rituals. He insisted that as long as the blood flowed and the prayers rose, he could hold death at bay. But even his priests, worn and hollow from decades of service, knew the truth. Their voices cracked with exhaustion, their eyes dim with hopelessness, and though they obeyed, they did so with the certainty that nothing could save their pharaoh now. Yet, in a strange way, his reign served as a reminder of Egypt's resilience. Though one king had sought to bend the world to his will, the land itself had endured, and so had its people. No ruler, no matter how long they lived, could outlast the heartbeat of Egypt. The Nile still flowed, the sun still rose over the desert sands, and the spirit of the nation, though bruised, was never broken. And so Pepi's story lived on, not as the tale of an immortal king, but as a human tragedy. A boy who was given everything, who grew into a man consumed by fear, and who left behind a legacy defined not by greatness, but by obsession. His monuments crumbled, his temples faded, but his name endured, carried forward not in glory, but as a caution whispered through time. For in the end, Pepi II proved what all men must face, that no amount of power, no wealth, no sacrifice can stop the turning of the wheel. Death waits for all, and it is not something to be feared or denied, but something to be understood. To live in fear of it is to miss the very purpose of life. Pepi's reign was long, longer than any before or after, but it was not life, it was survival, stretched thin and hollow. And survival without joy, without honor, without compassion, is no true victory. Time marched on, as it always does, and Pepi's name slipped further into the realm of legend. Historians would later write of him as the pharaoh who reigned the longest, a record that would stand for thousands of years. Yet numbers alone could not tell the truth of his life. Behind the length of his rule was a story of decay, of fear, of a man who sought to cage the inevitable and ended up caging his people instead. His empire bore the burden of his obsession, and though Egypt survived him, it carried the weight of those years like a shadow across its golden history. And so, as we look back across the sands of time, Pepi II remains both a marvel and a warning. A boy who rose to unimaginable power, a ruler who outlasted all who came before him, yet a man who proved that even kings cannot outrun death. His reign teaches us that fear, when left to rule the heart, can consume everything: faith, love, compassion, even the glory of a nation. He lived longer than most, but what did that length bring him? Not joy, not peace, not immortality. Only shadows, rituals, and the hollow echo of a life stretched thin. Perhaps that is why his story endures. Not because he conquered death, but because he failed to. Not because he left behind a kingdom of greatness, but because his flaws were so deeply human that they outlived his monuments. In his desperate attempt to be remembered as eternal, Pepi carved his legacy not in stone, but in warning, that life is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how it is lived. And no matter how powerful, how wealthy, or how fearful a man may be, death will always have the final word. So when we remember Pepi II, we do not remember a god, nor even a king. We remember a man fragile, terrified, consumed by obsession. A man who teaches us, even now, that eternity is not found in the desperate clinging to life, but in the mark we leave on the hearts of others. That is immortality. That is legacy. And that is something Pepi, for all his years, never truly found.